Hello and welcome back to Widowed AF. You're here with your host, Rosie Gill-Moss, and I am delighted to welcome to the show Sarah Swainson. Hello, Sarah, and thank you for joining us.
Hi, Rosie. Thanks for having me.
Well, as always, I'm terribly sorry that you kind of find yourself here because the prerequisite for membership of this club is a fairly crappy reason. So firstly, I'm sorry that you find yourself in the Widow Club. And I'm also really grateful that you've come on to talk about Paul and his death, because Sarah and I have had a couple of text exchanges, and I know that you've been quite nervous about this. So as we all are before we do this, and I just sort of said to you off mic that, you know, it's the first time any of us do this and it is terrifying. So thank you for being brave enough to come on, because it is scary, I know.
It is scary, yeah. But I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, I do think it, and as I also said, it's supposed to make you feel better afterwards, not worse, and that's the whole ethos behind it. So, Sarah, really, without kind of much further ado, I'm going to get you to tell me and our listeners what happened, because I know very little, which is a choice I make. I like to hear it sort of live, as it were, and I know that Paul died at 45, and the coroner described it as a drug-related death.
That's right, yeah.
Okay, and obviously that's going to cast a shadow over so much of your grief and so much of your recovery from grief. So if you wouldn't mind just sharing with us what happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And I one of the reasons that I really appreciate the opportunity to speak about what happened was because it's taken me an awful long time to be able to feel open about the circumstances around Paul's death. Partly because there's an awful lot of stigma and judgment around people that struggle with addiction. And Paul was a really, really wonderful human being. He was hugely intelligent. He was a committed family man. He had a really good job. He had a wonderful home. We had an incredible relationship, an incredible marriage, you know, a wonderful family, a blended family of, you know, many children.
I hear
you. Big family. And, you know, we lived a really blessed life in so many ways. But he was a man who really struggled with his mental health, had a story of his own, and it's not my place to tell Paul's story. It's my place to tell mine. Obviously, Paul is part of my story.
Very much
but
so.
He had a story that was full of pain, and he, you know, he had a you know, quite a turbulent life. And I'm really honoured to have been able to offer him some stability later on in his life. But he had a very, very traumatic life, and that all of his adult life had involved some kind of dependency. So, you know, I knew Paul from when we were very, very young. We met when I was 14 years old. So,
oh, wow.
So, you know, we had a lifelong relationship, really. We were friends when we were children. So we always knew Paul's challenges. I always knew that he had issues with substance abuse. And, you know, I knew a lot of his story. And it's really misunderstood. You know, Paul and I, we got together as adults when we'd, you know, had failed relationships, we had children, and we kind of blended our family, and we had a, you know, a really wonderful, wonderful life. But I always knew that there was this underlying risk. I guess the word is a risk. I knew he relied on alcohol quite heavily. That was
Can I ask what substances? I know that feels a bit intrusive, but no, I think it's kind of part of the story.
Absolutely. I knew that he had issues with heroin addiction when he was younger.
Oh, goodness.
And I'd actually, I'd been kind of on the periphery of his kind of friendship group when he was younger. Yeah. So I knew that he'd really got into some fairly dark places with heroin addiction. And I think partly it it didn't start there. It kind of started with kind of other drugs that were maybe considered to be slightly more recreational. And then he kind of fell into this kind of trap of using heroin.
I mean, I've written down the word oblivion, because this just sounds to me like essentially a child and then a young adult just seeking oblivion. And you alluded to a traumatic life. And sorry, I sort of wanted to interject here, because you spoke briefly at the beginning about the stigma of addicts. And I have to say, all I'm feeling here is just this enormous empathy for a man who was trying to stop his own mind from torturing him. And yeah, it's I think when you have skirted around mental health and you know how desperate you are to grasp at a relief, you feel much more compassionate for people who do. And nobody chooses heroin, do they? Nobody goes, oh, I know how I want to spend my life.
No, and I think, sorry. No, it's fine. And I think that's part of it. I think one of the things that I think is a really important message is that it's easy to kind of depersonalize people that are in active addiction, to actually see the addiction and not the person that's underneath it. And actually, you know, there are reasons that people make that. And I use the word choice very loosely, because I'm not sure that it's a choice. But it's not an easy road to travel down. It really isn't. And some of the choices that Paul made later on in his life that ultimately caused his death were related to situations that he just didn't know how to cope with. His mum died in September of 2017, and he just didn't know how to manage how he felt. He didn't have any positive coping strategies to deal with his grief. He just didn't know what to do with it. He just absolutely, he'd lived a life where he'd used either drugs or alcohol the whole of his adult life to numb his feelings, because he didn't know how to effectively manage those difficult feelings.
And actually, it's no wonder, is it? Because I know when I started to look into my problematic drinking, you realise that as a society, I refer particularly to the UK, but we drink when we're sad, we drink when we're happy. My dad's in recovery. He's been sober 26 years. And I said to him, oh God, won't you drink at my wedding? And it's the idea that we drink when we're happy, we drink when we're sad. And when people are going through a grief or bereavement, the automatic default response in people like Paul and like myself is to squash down those feelings in any way possible, because my God, what do you do with those? Those are extra feelings that you can't cope with.
Yeah, and it's really, when you speak about it more openly, and I hope that by speaking about it more openly, we can have this greater empathy for people that are in active addiction, because it destroys people. It really does change. It changes people. It changes their ability to be able to actually get in touch with their feelings. And I think that for me was one of the more challenging things around Paul's relapse into heroin addiction. Was I always knew that about Paul. As I said, we met when we were younger. When we first embarked on our relationship, we knew there were risk factors with each other. He knew that I'd been unfaithful in my previous marriage. I knew that he had issues with addiction. So we had those very early conversations about, okay, well, there are these risk factors. How are we going to manage this? If, one of us feels that we aren't happy in what we've got, or, we feel tempted to go off and do that really damaging thing that's going to damage our relationship, how are we going to manage that? What conversations do we need to have? And that was kind of
so really grown-up conversations, actually, that a lot of people will avoid. And I think knowing each other, sort of your quirks and warts and all, so to speak, means that you you do go into this very open. And I sort of hid the extent of my drinking and things quite a lot. I was quite secretive. And as I kind of came through the recovery process and admitted that there was a problem, what I discovered was, how many people did not drink like I did. How many times I would go out for a meal and like people would have one glass of wine. What? Like, why aren't you just watching the waiter constantly, right? But also how many people I know that are clearly stuck in problematic drinking and sort of don't know how to stop because it's all they've ever known. And they don't want to have these grown-up conversations because it does mean shining a light back in on themselves. And it does sound like you guys were really self-aware of the risks.
I thought we were.
Well, I was going to say, it doesn't tally in with the whole story.
No, I think that was one of the challenges. Was shortly after Jane died, Paul. It was around Christmas time. He had an ear infection, and he was in absolute agony. And it was actually Christmas Eve that we ended up in A&E at the local hospital because he was in so much pain, and it was Christmas Eve, so there's no doctors, and they prescribed him codeine because there wasn't a pharmacy open, so they needed to get his pain under control, so they prescribed him codeine. And it just didn't, that's a, it's one of those sliding doors moments when you're just like, had that not happened, would all of those things not triggered for him? And I think he would have sought that out anyway, to be honest, given how desperate he was feeling. He'd been his mum's primary carer for quite some time. Right. She died of cancer, and his whole purpose for quite some time had been caring for his mum. His mum wasn't there anymore. He had all these difficult feelings. His purpose had kind of been taken away from him. And then, kind of the opiate doorway was opened for him.
And it's a lot easier than therapy and talking about your issues. It is initially the easy option. It very quickly ceases to be the easy option.
Yeah, and it's that level of detachment. And Paul went through, it wasn't until the August of 2018 that he'd, and I don't know, I'll never know the truth about when he started using heroin again. He became incredibly dishonest. And, I can't really even describe it, but the level of kind of anxiety that came along with my relationship with him.
On your side or both sides?
For me, because I didn't know who was coming home,
Oh, okay.
Off work. I didn't know which version of Paul would be.
And now I am fortunate enough not to have experience of being around anybody that has a severe opioid addiction or heroin addiction. And if you're able to, and I don't want to sound like I'm being sort of voyeuristic, but just sort of able to elaborate a little bit on what that was like, again, at your discretion.
Yeah, initially it was him just seeming really not very with it. There'd been times, detached. So just not really very with it. Very, very forgetful. Very, very sleepy at times. To the point he'd be falling asleep in in his dinner, kind of. And so I knew something was really, really wrong. There was, his behaviour just changed. The place, his kind of daily routine started to change. He would sort of be away, go to the shop and then be away longer than he needed to be. Yeah. And looking back on it now, there were signs fairly early on that something, there was something going wrong. But we'd had these conversations about how if he ever felt that way, that he would talk to me about it. And he hadn't talked to me about it. And I'd said to him a couple of times, look, something's really wrong. You need to talk to me about what's going on. And he fundamentally denied that there was any substance abuse. And it actually got to the point where I thought I was the one that was going crackers. So he was so convincing. And, we had doctor's appointments where he basically had us all convinced that he was having some kind of breakdown. and that, you know, all of his strange behaviour was due to him having this breakdown.
Do you need to get that?
No, it's fine.
So it's okay, don't worry, PT. And I also think that the human brain is quite clever in that, yes, there might have been all these signs that you were, if you broke them down, you were kind of glaringly aware of what it was. But in the moment, you would be making, okay, well, that's viable. That could be true. You don't want to disbelieve somebody you love. And you probably didn't want to believe that this was going to be your life again. And, you know.
Absolutely. And I think there was part of me that was like, well, no, he wouldn't do that to us, because you know, the basis of our relationship is this trust that we've got between.
Hang on, your computer has stopped recording. Let me just see. So you took. Oh, there we go. We both went to fill the gap there. So professional. You carry on, Sarah. It's your episode.
I think you know, we'd had this agreement that we would talk to each other about things, and when things were going really wrong, you know, there's this. All of my being was like, no, he wouldn't do this to us. You know, we've had this is the basis of our relationship. This is the actual foundation of what we've built together, is that we would be honest with our, you know, our worst bits of ourselves. And, you know, a couple of friends said to me, look, you know, I think there's something going on. And I'm like, no, you know, he wouldn't do that. But it just became, you know, more and more apparent that things were really very, very wrong. But, you know, he even had doctors convinced that he was having a breakdown.
This is the addiction, is it turns people into actors and thieves and liars and
absolutely
just sort of versions of the person that you don't know. And, you know, because I've seen other people go through addictions, not heroin, I have to say, but it's it's brutal watching it. And I mean, even myself, you know, I was hiding wine bottles and putting them into the recycling bin at school because I didn't want my mum to know how much I was drinking. You know, you become, and I am probably honest to a fault. I don't like lies. I'm very sensitive to lies. And yet there I was lying to people that I loved.
Absolutely. And I think, and, you know, there were children involved. So he was really unreliable and he was unsafe, and he, you know, I couldn't leave him with our little girl. She must have been three when things started going really wrong. So she was really little. And then there were older children involved. I've got 2 children from my previous marriage. He had 3 children from 2 previous relationships.
Well, so you trump even us and our 4. Well done.
All of those children are in the mix, and it's like, well, how do I protect those children from what's going on, and how do I make this right, and how do I navigate this really difficult kind of situation? And then in the August, it all kind of blew up, because it was just getting worse and worse and worse. You know, he was, you know, being really very unreliable, very untrustworthy. You know, things were wrong to the point that I, like I said to you previously, to the point I thought that I was going completely bananas.
You
know, I had bought a tracking device for his car because something's going really wrong here. And I didn't ever put it on his car because I didn't get a chance to, but it had gotten to the point where I'm like, no, you know, he's not telling me the truth. I don't know what's going on. I don't believe a word that's coming out of his mouth anymore.
So you've had to become a different person. You've had to become a private detective, and you've had to become the kind of person that has to spy on somebody they love. And you talk about addiction making them a different person. It makes you a different person as well, because who wants to spy on people? I don't, but
it's awful.
You're desperate.
Absolutely. And it was the day that he finally admitted what was going on to me. It was kind of forced, because I was basically watching him, and he was in the bathroom in our home. We'd come home, we'd been out for the day. In fact, we'd been out to the columbarium where his mum's ashes were, and he'd spent most of the time sat on his own in, you know, quiet contemplation, shall we say. And we'd come home, and I'm like, look, things are not good. And he'd gone straight into the bathroom, and the bathroom window was open, and our bathroom's on the lower floor of our home. And so I watched him through the window, and he had foil in his hands, And I'm like, for me, that's, you know, there's no way that this isn't heroin use. And this was in our bathroom in our home with his 2 children in the house at the same time, and our little one as well. And just the panic, I can't even begin to describe to you the panic and just the sheer shock and horror of, like,
just seeing your worst fear in front
my
of you.
worst fear. And so I challenged him about it, but he'd hidden, by the time I got to him, he'd hidden it again, and I couldn't find it. I searched the bathroom, but he'd obviously had it on his person, and short of kind of, you know,
strip searching,
yes, accosting him, and the kids were in the house, so it was limited to what I could do without really causing a really major ruckus in front of the kids. And later on that day, and it's a memory that goes through my head quite a lot, and it's a memory that I've had to have really quite a significant amount of support around. Paul was a really placid, you know, a really gentle man. Even when he was dishonest and all those other things, he was a really, really gentle natured person. And he squared up to me over me challenging him in our kitchen. And I, you know, the shock of that, he squared up to me and he said, "What the was that about? How dare you suggest?"
He went straight to defense.
Yeah, how dare you suggest that I'm doing this, particularly with the children around. And I said to him, there is something really wrong here. Either you are not telling me the truth, or I'm going completely mad.
Yeah, but either way, there's an issue.
Yeah, either way, you need to help me with this, because either I need some really serious support and I need your help with that, or you need some really serious support and I need to help you with that.
I mean, what a beautiful way of putting it. I mean, this is incredible. This is, hearing you say it is, got a bit of reverb coming back. Sorry. But yeah, hearing you say that, you know, either one of you, as you're lying or I'm mad. I mean, that surely, hopefully made him think. I mean, you're probably going to tell me now.
Well, I mean, it did, because he then came back and told me the truth. So he then came back and was able to tell me, actually, Sarah, I mean, you know, I'm using heroin again, and I'm in a
humanity
really bad
in
way.
him was there.
Yeah, and it, you know, the whole bottom of my world fell out, but along with that came a certain amount of relief, because you know, I knew what we were dealing with. Up until that point, I didn't know what we were dealing with, and so, you know, so. And at that point, that was when we were able to look at treatment and support. But even that was a challenge, because Paul's entire kind of being was, I've messed all this up now. I need to go away. I need to leave. I need to, you know, you guys deserve better than me, so I'm going to leave you. And that was his answer. Right, I'm going to run away from this. I've made a mess. I don't know how to
leave you to pick it up.
I'm going to run away. So, and, you know, you can see the pattern here, can't you, around, this is difficult, I don't like it, I'm going,
and really sadly, actually, because I'm listening to you describe Paul and his reaction to things, and there is an element, I have to say, and I'm aware I'm making this about me, but, you know, my podcast, and but for the grace of God, a God I don't believe in, but this need to run away from your feelings and numb them, I'm so familiar with it. You know, I just thank God I was never exposed to opioids, because who knows, because this burning need to not feel your pain and to take yourself away from the situation. I can't tell you the amount of times I've been, you know, if I've been in a spiral, I've been like, right, I'm just going to leave. I'm terrible, you know, and I'm able to come back from it. But the need to take yourself away because you feel that you are toxic to the people you love, that's really breaking my heart hearing this.
Yeah, but it, you know, and
But also, why should you be left to deal with it? There's an anger here as well, because it's not your fucking fault.
You know, there's you know, I think it opens up, like you said earlier on, this wider societal issue around how we deal with our feelings. You know, our really positive feelings and our more difficult ones, and the spectrum of those feelings, and how we manage and communicate and what we do to support people so they're not feeling as though they need to run away from things. I mean,
Yeah.
Paul's issues were really, he was 45 when he died. We're talking about a lifetime of embedded running away. But how do we support our young people so that they don't get into that cycle? But he did tell me the truth, and I did say to him, I did say to him, look, you've made this mess. You're going to stick around and you're going to fix it. I'm not going to allow you to run away from this, because
good on you.
We need to fix this. And so I supported him into rehab. But the difficult thing for Paul, and the more and also for me, was he didn't want anybody to know. So he admitted this thing to me, this, his awful secret. But it was obvious to just about anybody that he was in contact with. He's still holding down a job. We had close
that's
friends.
impressive.
He and all of those people were completely aware that something was very wrong. But the first thing he said to me after he'd admitted what was going on was, "But you can't tell anyone."
And that's another weight on you. I'm going to tell you this enormous, life-changing piece of information, but you can't share this with anyone. You have to shoulder the burden. And I feel quite bad for you, actually.
Well, at that point, I did say, no, this isn't how this is going to work.
Good.
Because actually, if you need me to support you, which I wholeheartedly want to do, I need to get support from somewhere. And you're not in a position to give me that support. So, I'm very lucky that I have a really, really amazing family. I've got a good network of friends, although that network has changed over this period of time. But, I had people that supported me. And I also got in touch with the organisation Drug Fam. I don't know if that's an organisation you're
It's not, but I'm going to write it down, because I do sadly speak to a lot of people who have had addiction problems, either themselves through their bereavement or their partners did.
Yeah. Well, Drug Fam are an organisation who support the families of people that are in addiction, and their primary focus is to care for the loved ones of people in active addiction so that they can still have a good quality of life while they're supporting their loved ones.
Yeah, because it's incredibly exhausting, isn't it? Especially when you're subjected to anger and resistance. And I've underlined the words here that you said, secrecy and shame. And you obviously you understand this widowed experience and the shame, and yours with the complications of drugs makes it worse. And I talk quite a lot about this idea that we're trolls under the bridge and nobody really knows what to do with us. And the secrecy and shame around drugs is very similar to that, isn't it? And can I just ask you, this is purely nosiness, but you talked about sort of friends and family and him holding a job down and them knowing something. Were they aware that heroin was even a sort of issue, or would they perhaps have assumed that it was something else? I'm just thinking, my go-to, if one of my friends' husbands was behaving oddly, wouldn't be, oh, he might have a heroin and opioid addiction.
Yeah.
I might assume an affair, or that sounds awful, but or sort of more, I guess, mainstream recreational drugs. So did people go to that immediate assumption, or were they kind of guessing at other things?
I think it was mixed. I mean, bearing in mind that I was absolutely adamant that it wouldn't be that. In the conversations I was having with people, I was saying, well, I don't think it is. I think there's definitely some substance misuse going on.
Yeah.
But my family obviously knew Paul's history, so there was always some questions, and close friends knew his history. He was the kind of guy who, and I'm sure you've met these people, and you may, I know I've done it myself at times, who would tell his life story, but with no emotional connection whatsoever.
Oh my goodness. Yes, that's me. I can tell people really traumatic things at the school gate and just watch their faces kind of not know what to do with me. And I do think that comes from having lived through a trauma as well. And I'm going to ask this, and we may not leave this in, but do you think there was a possibility that he had perhaps neurodivergence? Because a lot of this, I'm hearing sort of ADHD type tendencies, that self-destruct and oblivion type thing. But I'm not a doctor; it's only my personal experience.
It's quite likely. They've had a lot of autism in the family, so it's quite likely. And
it's a melting pot when you have the autism and the ADHD, because you are just so much more likely to be in addiction and suffer from mental health problems. And whilst I'm not saying this is the root cause of it, but everything you're saying to me, I'm hearing so much of what I've heard within the community of, this need to burn it down, basically. Just this need to burn it down. It's a very peculiar drive.
Yeah, but he was also highly focused and highly intelligent in certain areas. So, it's possible.
It's only I'm asking because I'm particularly interested in having a neurodivergent child and seeing, with the knowledge that we have now, about wanting to protect their sort of emotional well-being. And I don't know, it's a personal interest rather than something relating to this podcast, but it may become a podcast at some point, but I digress. Sorry, I must draw you back into your story, Sarah. I love a little tangent, as you'll probably know if you listen regularly. So he is obviously now shrouded in this kind of shame and secrecy, and you've got him into rehab. Is it residential rehab?
It was at home. So the services are limited, to be honest with you, and that's part of the challenge of people that are in active addiction, is the actual services that are available to people are limited. The resources and the funding are limited. Treatment's expensive, and I get that treatment's expensive, but he contacted the local kind of rehab organisation,
drug and alcohol support.
Yeah, exactly that. And they and I went with him, and we, he did all the right things. Because he was aware that there were major trust issues between us, I had full access to all of his kind of medical stuff with the doctors. So he started to really turn things around in relation to try and say, look, I want to fix this. I want to get better. And so he started on some treatment. He'd previously gone through methadone treatment when he was previously in heroin addiction, and was absolutely adamant he didn't want to do that again, because his words were, methadone's more difficult to come off of than heroin. And I think it probably is. I mean, I think, from what I can gather from speaking to him, coming off of methadone was really, really very difficult. And so he was put onto an alternative medication, and I can't remember what it's called now, but but he had an alternative treatment, and he started that, and again, it's at home, so we had to go to the pharmacist, and
that's a shame, isn't it? Having to queue up for your...
Yeah, absolutely. So we, and for a long time we had to go to the pharmacist to collect his prescription, and he had to take it there. So, I'm sure everybody's seen that room, that line, and it's a challenging thing, but I have to say,
it's humiliating, isn't it, for a man? A man.
I have to say, the pharmacist where Paul went, they treated him with the utmost of respect.
That's really nice to hear, actually.
And it's a message that I had given to the pharmacist there personally. But they treated him with kindness and respect,
like a human being.
Absolutely, like a human being. But when he first started the medication, they got it wrong. So it's supposed to be taken in two parts. So there's a first dose, then there's a second dose 4 hours later. So we were supposed to take the second dose and bring that home and have it 4 hours later, but they made him take all of it in one go, which meant that within about half an hour he was in full withdrawal, like total opiate withdrawal. I actually thought he was going to die.
So this stuff, it isn't like a replacement opiate. It sort of forces through the withdrawal, and they put. It's
the treatment center explained it, that it's the way that it attaches into the synapses in the brain. It's more sticky, so it would kick out all of the heroin and replace it, but it would kick it all out to begin with. So it puts you into full-blown withdrawal, which is why you have to do it a little bit at a time. So we had he started the treatment on the Thursday. On the Friday, they didn't have anybody that could prescribe at the service. So he spent from the Thursday through till the Monday pretty much in full-blown withdrawal.
Jesus, the poor guy.
It was pretty hideous to witness as well, to be honest.
What did you do with the children? Were you able
Thankfully, my mum and dad were able to help with the children. So Ellie,
God bless mum and dad,
really little. So basically, we stayed at home, and I've never seen a person so unwell, Rosie. He was so unwell. Watching somebody in heroin withdrawal is really very, very traumatic. And there was nothing that anybody could do, because actually, even if he had taken some heroin at that point, the medication that he'd have taken, it wouldn't have overridden. It wouldn't have overridden the medication that he'd taken. And he did have to go to the chemist every day and have some more of the medication that they'd given him, but it wasn't enough. So it wasn't enough to stave off the withdrawal. So they did, once there was a prescribing member of staff at the service on the Monday, they were able to increase his dose to level him off. But
you can't imagine being in that sort of pain for that long and receiving so little support and empathy, because if you presented with in that sort of pain from anything else, you'd be met with compassion and kindness. But if people view that you have done this to yourself, it's almost like a punishment. It's like moral kind of, you've become quite moralistic about it. But I've never, as I said, I've seen Trainspotting, but to witness somebody going through this, you must be in absolutely no doubt that this was not a choice.
No, absolutely. And knowing that he'd been through heroin treatment previously, so he'd done the hard work once. So actually, to put himself back into the position where he knew that he would have to come out the other end sometime, one way or another.
Brave.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a choice. It's entirely a coping strategy. It is an I can't cope with my thoughts, feelings.
Yeah. You're not taking it because you want to go out and party, are you? I mean, I convinced myself for a long time that that's who I was. I was this party girl. But of course, you're not. You don't take heroin to have a good time, presumably. You take it to escape.
Absolutely. Well, and that's exactly what it was. It was a way of detaching from the reality of his thoughts and feelings. And so he did go through treatment, and with some support, he seemed to be doing quite well. He went to all his appointments, he did all the things he was supposed to do. But I think we talked about the services. What he really needed was to be able to talk about his thoughts and feelings.
Yeah.
But that's really difficult when you've got somebody that's in a situation where they're being managed for an opioid addiction, because they're detached. So how do you manage dealing with these really difficult thoughts and feelings when that person is still detached? Because although they're not on the heroin anymore, they're still on a substitute medication that is still going to cause some level of detachment from their feelings.
Yeah.
So it becomes a really difficult thing to do. You don't want that person to relapse into heroin addiction, but they're also not in a place where you can necessarily say, well, let's do some talking therapy. Let's do all these things that are going to get to the underlying cause.
And these things take time, don't they? Years often of talking therapy. I know that you can often access 6 weeks, but in my personal experience, that isn't enough.
No.
Not when you're dealing with real deep-rooted trauma and addiction. And things like EDMR therapy, which sound like they would have been really beneficial, he wouldn't have been able to access it because of the substances in his body.
Absolutely.
So you're sort of rocking a hard place. He wants to get better. He wants to live. He wants to beat the addiction. But I suppose you have to deal with the thing that kills you first, which would be the heroin, and then you deal with the underlying cause. But the time, the waiting times. And I happen to know of somebody that went to the GP's office and opened a vein because he couldn't get help. And this is the level of desperation people are getting to because they can't access the services, or they're not that by the point you would need them, it's too late to wait 6 weeks, to wait 12 weeks. You need instant access. I don't have an answer, but I can feel the desperation here.
Yeah. And actually, you could argue that at the point when somebody starts using substances to manage is already too late.
Mm-hmm.
Because, once somebody starts relying on those substances, actually it's the things that they are trying to avoid that are causing those things. So actually saying to somebody, well, let's talk about the thing that's making you want to escape. It's like, that's going to be like big, like red
And I used to do a lot of talking and crying when I was drunk. And of course, that doesn't really do anything because you haven't processed anything, have you? So I'm like, no, I processed all my grief. And then I was like, well, did you though? And reprocessing it sober is quite the experience.
Absolutely. So he, I thought he was doing okay. And but there was an element also in there where Paul had been really clear with me. And it was early on. He basically said to me, look, we're going to have to, and I did. And I think it was a bit of a mistake in hindsight. He said, I can't deal with your pain. I can't hear how angry you are with me. I can't hear how, upset you are with me, how much damage I cause to our relationship right now, because that's going to hinder my recovery. And I could understand the logic behind that, in the sense that actually what he was trying to do was escape from difficult things. So within our relationship, if I'm saying, actually, Paul, you've really effed this up, actually, I'm really angry with you, actually, you've done X, Y, and Z to damage our relationship, that's not going to be supportive in his recovery. So I had to kind of park that stuff with him.
Oh, that's challenging for you, isn't it?
But I had to, I had other outlets. I had, I was seeing Drug Fam weekly. I had a support group. I had my family. I had my friends. I had other outlets for that stuff. But in relation to kind of really healing our marriage, I was waiting for Paul to get better so that then we could do that work together. And I needed him to be emotionally available to do that work, which when somebody's, in active addiction or in treatment for addiction, that's not necessarily where they're at. They're not necessarily.
It's all that matters, isn't it? It's all that matters in that moment.
So I thought he was getting better. He did have a small relapse, and they increased the treatment level again. And again, that came with dishonesty. There wasn't the, that honesty that I'd hoped for, in that it was I've told them that I'm not coping, so I've asked them to increase my medication. And it's like, okay. And, I contacted the service and they said, actually, he's relapsed. So it wasn't. But again,
you must have felt like you were banging your head against a brick wall at times, Sarah. You must have been so frustrated with him. But the sympathy and the empathy is there. But you must just have wanted to shake him.
Totally.
Just stop it.
Totally, absolutely. And actually, at that point, it's like, I'm with you in this. I'm walking alongside you with this. I'm 100% with you. I'm not against you. And actually, being honest with me is going to be better than the dishonesty. But it almost becomes embedded. It becomes part of, and it's
a shame, isn't it?
It is the shame. And that's exactly it. If there wasn't this shame around addiction, would people be more able to say, I've got this issue, I've got this problem, I've done this, I've done this thing that's damaging me, I've done this thing that's damaged our relationship, how can we work it out?
And I think you're so right. I think the shame kind of makes you double down into it, and you don't want to say I'm struggling, and because you don't want to bring that kind of cloud of your dad's a heroin addict or your husband.
Absolutely.
It taints things, and it's not, I don't know, there is a cloud of shame under it, there is. And
but there's also this kind of there's a stereotype around
yes, there is, yeah,
what a person in addiction
yes, there is, you're right,
like. And actually Paul wasn't that stereotype. Like I said to you, he was, you know, he was a gentleman. He was a kind family man with a really good job, highly intelligent, all of the things that, you know, when people throw the word junkie around or drugging,
it must hurt you to hear that sort of language as well.
It does, but it, you know, I know that they're talking about that stereotype of, but even so, you know, that person, even that stereotypical person in active addiction is still a person, and that person's still got a story, and that person is not there because that's where they want to be. And I think we're very quick as a society to kind of ostracize these people that are in a really dark place often. And you know, that's one of the things that I hope, talking about addiction, it's one of those things that I hope in talking more about it will start to lift that veil of shame, so that more people can say, actually, no, I've got this issue, or you know, talk to that person that's struggling, saying, look, I can see something's wrong, you know, rather than saying, oh, well, that person's clearly using drugs, I don't want to have anything to do with them.
Exactly that. And we all know that often if the drugs involved, the household may become unsafe, and you know, there's a kind of instinctive perhaps not to want your children to go to someone's house if you suspect there's a drug problem. But you're so right, they're still people, they are human beings. And I really feel like the idea that anybody who puts a needle into their arm, or, you know, anybody that repeatedly does something that causes harm to themselves and the people they love, that's addiction. And whatever that addiction may be, and many of us, you know, many of our listeners will be addicted to sugar, to alcohol, to cigarettes, to shopping, to sex. If your addiction, or that you happen, and I use the term, you know, there by the grace of God, that it happens to be that your coping mechanism, if you are introduced to something as insidious as heroin, who would any of us be strong enough to you know, to fight that addiction? And I just think we're all very kind of, it's very easy to cast judgment and to feel very safe in our little ivory towers, in our bubbles, where we feel protected from all this scary stuff that goes on. And I refer to widowhood like this as well. It was something that happened to other people. And then when that comes to your door and you realize that it is a human affliction, and it stems from trauma and damage and pain, not a reckless destruction and a willingness to cause harm for most people. You know, I can't speak for everybody. And I think what you're doing here is you are rehumanizing people in addiction, and I'm really grateful to you for doing this. And I'm afraid, going to have to ask you what happened, because if he was making progress, what happened?
I think he talked about heroin as being a trickster. So he talked about it like it had a personality, like it was like this demon that had this personality within him. And he talked about this kind of voice in his head that told him that it would be okay. He could do it once, and then he could put it down again. And that wasn't the reality of it. He, you know, and in his, you know, more in his stronger moments, he knew that it was a trick. But in his weaker moments, that voice became overpowering for him. And I'd taken my boys and our little girl away on holiday. We'd gone to Scotland for a few days to see some friends. So we were hundreds of miles away, and Paul had decided that he'd have a little party at home. So he invited some friends over, bearing in mind that it wasn't
particular type of friends.
Well, there's a bit of a story about that, but I'll get there in a sec. But
no, I'm pushing you through. Sorry, I'm genuinely fascinated by your story, or you're captivating.
We were like hundreds and hundreds of miles away, and he'd invited some people over, and I was okay with that. You know, he said he was going to have a few drinks with some friends that I knew, that I trusted. He seemed to be in a good place. But those friends didn't know that he was in heroin addiction treatment, because it had been kept quite small. Whilst family and very close friends knew he was in treatment, these other people didn't know that he was in treatment, and he wasn't very open about the fact because of the shame attached to it. But then it transpired that another friend was here. Now, this was a friend that he had been involved with heroin use with in his past. They'd maintained a friendship, and I knew that this person had had really significant challenges and continued to have significant challenges with heroin use. He'd just been kicked out of his home because his then partner had discovered he was using heroin again. I'm aware that this person turns up on our doorstep, which, well, that's what Paul told me anyway, that he'd just turned up and he couldn't turn him away. He didn't have anywhere to go. That I don't think was the truth. But he had this party, and I didn't see him alive again. Basically, I spoke to him on the night before he was having his friends over, and I just said, look, I'm really not happy that this person is at our home. I don't think it's a sensible. I don't think you're in a place where you can be supporting him. You're in treatment yourself. I get that you've got a connection with him and that you've got experience and that you can help and support him. And Paul was a really genuinely loving guy, and I believe he genuinely wanted to help this other chap out. But somewhere in that mix, there ended up being drug use in the house. There was, I think, the idea for some of them that it would be recreational drug use, but I use the term very loosely. But Paul clearly had heroin with him, and I don't know whether I will never know the truth. The long and short of it is,
I'm thinking here like Lulu's story, which I don't know whether you've heard it. I'm going to send you a link to it, because her situation with her husband was very similar in that, he didn't have a history of drug use, but he was found with heroin in his system, and they have no idea how. But the unanswered questions, because nobody's going to put their hand up and tell you what happened in this situation, are they?
No, exactly that. So I was hundreds and hundreds of miles away, in the Highlands of Scotland. There'd been this party. I'd spoken to him on the Saturday night. On the Sunday, I just hadn't heard from him. And he was very good at sleeping anyway, because he was really very good at drinking and staying up late. So he was, I wasn't expecting to hear from him before kind of, mid-afternoon anyway. And I just didn't hear from him. He wasn't responding to his text messages, or he wasn't answering the landline phone. And in the end, I said to my neighbour, look, I'm really, really worried now. I've not heard anything from him. Can you just go and check everything's okay? And then I had a phone call from her to say that she'd found that he was dead in bed. So he died in the house here. But at that point, I didn't know what had happened.
Yeah.
I knew there had been. I knew that there'd been some cocaine use in the house, because the people that were with him had told me. I knew they'd been drinking quite a lot, and I knew that he'd vomited, because obviously that was evident from them the way they found him. So there were questions about, well, has he been sick in his sleep and choked? But at that point, I didn't know. And it wasn't for quite some time until toxicology kind of came back that there was evidence that there were opiates in his system. But then there would have been opiates in his system.
I was going to say,
he was on medication that would have flagged that anyway. So it wasn't until much, much later on, months later on, that it became apparent that there was illicit heroin use.
So he'd had heroin as well as the replacement.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
what do they think happened, that it just overloaded his system and he couldn't cope with the amount of it, or had his body just given up?
Yeah, I honestly don't know the answer. It's one of those things that you think that the coroner, that they'll be able to find out through, things like what time he died and exactly what happened. They just don't know. All they know is that he had drugs in his system and that his death was likely to have been because of drugs in his system. It's possible.
But you don't actually know.
No, I don't actually know. All I know is that there was heroin use. It's likely that he went into respiratory failure because heroin, just slows your system down completely. So it's likely that he went into respiratory failure. But he was sick. It's possible that he could have vomited in his sleep and just not been coherent enough to be able to, stop himself.
And it is
just don't know.
And unfortunately, that is quite a high risk, isn't it? Even with alcohol and things, is this kind of choking on your own vomit. And I genuinely believe it was not through alcohol, but the cause of my husband's death, because he'd been sick on the boat before he went into the water. We don't know because his body's not been found. But how awful for you. And did you have to drive back knowing that you were going to get home and find your husband dead?
I was, I'd say, lucky. I was with some really good friends, so they basically sort of scooped us up. So they drove me to the airport, so they contacted the hire car company and got the insurance changed, because I couldn't have driven a car if I'd have wanted to.
I was thinking, I don't know how you could have done that.
I couldn't have driven a car if I'd have wanted to.
Yeah.
But the feeling, like the I can feel it now, that kind of
the wobbly legs and the dread,
the feeling of taking that phone call. But I think so I got home safely, so they got me to the airport. My mum and dad picked us up at the other end, and I went and stayed with my mum and dad because I didn't want to come back to the house initially. But I waited a few days and then I came back because I knew if I didn't, then I never would. It became, would have become a real barrier. So I had to kind of come back fair.
Sort of face that fear, face another fear, Sarah, is what you had to do. You had to face another thing head on. And what courage you have. And the children, I don't know exactly how old the children were, but I'm thinking in particular of your little girl who must have been very young at this time. How old was she?
She was 4 when Paul died.
Oh, gosh. Oh, poor little love. And how are they now? How are you now? I mean, I've jumped a little bit because I would like to know, and I know that I'm taking up quite a lot of your time this morning, but there's so much in this story. And so, sorry, I'm just going to go. Things like telling people in the funeral, that must have come very tainted for you as well, because when you're widowed, the one thing you do get mostly is some compassion and kindness. Now, I have a friend who was recently widowed, very recently, and by suicide. And it's different because his family are angry, and the whole thing feels it's not a pure grief. Does that sound really weird? And so doing things like funerals and telling people that just the added complexity, I suppose, is what I'm trying to, and I suppose what I'm trying to get across here is, what it feels like. I have a fair idea of what it feels like. We have 30,000 listeners, many of whom don't know how it feels like, and it is awful, isn't it? I suppose I'm processing your feelings over here, so Christ knows how you did it. But yeah, the additional shame and sort of questions over it, and just not knowing how he died. I appreciate that horrible lasting impression. So how did you manage to have a funeral, and were people kind to you?
I mean, Paul was really, really well loved. And I think that was
so often aren't they?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most significant challenges I found was the Paul that I had been living with for that period of time since his relapse. He was a very different man to the person that everybody knew, and most people didn't know about his difficulties. They just didn't. And so their and you know, I'm glad about it. You know, and the children didn't know about the difficulties, because there was a lot of kind of protection that went all around that, around protecting their relationship with their dad, because I didn't want them to know that side of him. So I didn't want that. So I took a lot of that. And I think that was one of the more challenging things, was I had to explain to quite a few people that didn't know what had been going on for Paul, including his family members, including his children. You know, I had to navigate that really difficult thing whilst really being quite angry at the same time.
And grieving, and the anger it's entirely natural. I'm angry with Ben. You know, I'm angry with Ben because he felt sick on the boat. He shouldn't have gone in the water.
Yeah.
Now, lots and lots of my friends and part of this kind of widow community that I'm in feel anger. And even if the person they love dies of cancer, you know, something completely out of their control, I say in inverted commas because I don't like to imply that our husbands died within their control.
Yeah.
But the anger is there because you are left to deal with the shit.
Yeah, absolutely.
The fallout. I mean, let's just be honest, the bloody admin involved.
Absolutely. I say it, and I say it in jest, but there is an element of me that means it, that if he'd have survived that night, I'd have bloody killed him anyway.
Yeah. My mum always said, she said, what would you do if he walked back in the door, you know, 6 months later? I'd be like, bloody. But it's you know, we can laugh about it because the dark humour is essentially what gets us through. But it is incredibly challenging to be managing all this grief, to be kind of exposing yourself and your husband, to exposing the secret life that you had and that he had.
I'm only just now bearing in mind that we're over 3 years down the line. I'm only just starting to be honest with people about it.
Yeah.
It was one of those things where people kind of made up their own mind anyway.
Yeah.
And I didn't ever challenge anybody. There were very few people that I spoke to openly and honestly about what happened to Paul, because of that shame, and because I didn't want them to judge him. I didn't want that judgment for him, because actually Paul wasn't that person. For a short period of time, he was in a really awful place. And
for sure,
that person I really didn't like very much. And it's taken me a long time to kind of merge those people together. Part of my coping strategy has been to split him into two people.
Okay,
my Paul and the other one.
Yeah.
The problem was they looked the same. And
they look the same, they sound the
same. But you know, it is.
I can see why you did, because I prefer to my sort of low-vis as the snake, and it sort of takes it away from being who I am, because I become a person I don't recognise, and it's manageable for me. But for you, when you are literally living in this Jekyll and Hyde, and also you're talking, you know, you've got people mourning the wonderful Paul, the fabulous Paul, the engaging, vivacious, charming Paul, but you've just lived with a very different Paul.
Absolutely.
And you've kind of instantly have to switch back into that loving wife role. Or my head's going like it. And obviously the children are aware now. And in terms of sort of doing this podcast and talking quite openly about it, how are you comfortable with them listening? I mean, your daughter's obviously very young. My children don't listen to the podcast, obviously, but I'm always very aware that they may do it at one point. And and I think that what you have said here to me is so beautiful and so compassionate to Paul and to people in addiction, that I think what you have shared is actually going to do people in addiction and people supporting them a huge service. And I think even if it makes maybe 10, 20 people a little bit kinder and a bit more compassionate, but we're also not saying that it's easy to love people in addiction, because it's really difficult.
No, and I think that's the other thing as well, that it's really important that I say that it's really important that if you are supporting somebody in addiction, that you have your own boundaries around what you're okay with, and that you get appropriate support, and that you're not allowing that person to consume all of you. Because actually there are times when you need to let that person take responsibility for their behaviour and allow really awful things to happen, because you can't control it. And that was one of the biggest things I needed to and I had to have an awful lot of support around it, was to realise that it wasn't me, that it wasn't because I hadn't done enough. Paul didn't die because he didn't love us enough. Paul didn't
or
die.
that you didn't love him enough.
Yeah, we didn't love him enough because we didn't do enough to support him, because I know, hand on heart, that I did everything that I could within my capacity to support him. But the addiction wasn't about me, and it wasn't about the children. It wasn't about any of those other things. It was about him, and only he had control of what was going on there. And it's so very difficult when you are in a relationship with somebody that's in active addiction, not to think, well, what have I done wrong? What have I done?
Why am I not enough? And
why
that's similar.
Exactly that. Why am I not enough?
And that's very similar when we talk to people who've lost people to suicide. Is this, what did I do wrong? Could I have not done it? Could I have done something more? What should I have not done that? And the self-blame and looking for answers, because let's be honest, none of us want to believe that this can happen. Absolutely. And so people are desperately looking for answers as to why. COVID springs to mind as an example. Anytime anybody got COVID, the first question is, did they, why? Did they have underlying health conditions? Because you want to know that this may not come knocking at your door.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, not one of us is immune. Addiction does not discriminate on class, on sex, on gender, on race. It's a chemical imbalance. I genuinely believe that makes some people more susceptible than others. And hearing how hard he struggled and how hard you fought for him, I'm just so sad that the end was so tragic, because he should have been here. He should be here to see his children, and he should be here with you. And I'm really, really sorry that he's not. I'd just like to ask my guests, just as we sort of come to the end of the interview, because sometimes it can be quite sad because we get to the point of their death. And I just really wondered what life is like for you now, and what kind of a life you've managed to build for yourself and for your children. And I suppose I'm asking you, not if you're happy, because you will always be sad, right? But but you've got both back, I hope.
Yeah. I am really happy. I think
that's brilliant. That's brilliant. And that's just what I wanted to hear. Thank you for saying that.
Part of the challenge of it is making an active decision that you're going to. I know my original things that I wrote about my experience, Paul died, but I didn't. And I think that's one of the most important things that I can say to anybody that goes through this, is I've had to make a really concerted effort to think about, okay, well, life's a gift. Nothing's a given. When you are in a marriage with somebody, you've got this future mapped out, and all of your stuff is invested in that relationship with that person, and your future and what you're going to do together. And when we retire, we'll do X, Y, and Z. You've got all of these hopes and dreams. When those things are taken, when those things aren't there anymore, you have to review everything. You have to decide, okay, well, what now? How am I going to navigate this? And I've had to work really hard, because I joined Way, and I joined lots of widowed groups and all that kind of stuff. And what it showed me was hope.
Yeah.
But it also showed me sometimes what I didn't want to be like. I didn't want to be that person 6 years down the line that's still wallowing in pity and anger and all of those things. I didn't want to be that person. And I didn't want to be the person that's picking up the glass of red wine every night to numb how I felt. I didn't want to do that.
So you don't want history to repeat itself,
absolutely,
do you? You've seen how that ends.
Exactly. And I feel as though I had an obligation to my children to show them that, yes, really awful things happen, and they do, and it is still okay. It's still okay to go out and live a life. And I didn't always do it well. I made some really awful mess ups along the way.
I think that's called being human, my darling. I think that's called being human.
In my early kind of widowhood, I was, either
me too,
or making rash decisions because I was so worried I was going to miss out on an opportunity.
Yes,
and
it's a common theme.
Yeah, it's kind of a wave of mess behind me. But I did the work. I've had the therapy. You know, I've spoken to Cruz, I had support from Drug Fam, I've done life coaching, I've had EMDR for...
Oh, you've had EMDR, that's interesting.
Yeah, for the PTSD stuff that came out of some of the things I witnessed. You know, I've done all of that stuff, and it's been a really arduous, really challenging journey. But, you know, I'm now in a position where I feel like I could have this conversation with you, Rosie. And for me, it's, you know, it's an amazing thing to have been able to speak about my experiences with somebody else's addiction and kind of look back at it and kind of unpack it with somebody. And it's a wonderful thing to do. But, you know, I'm now in a very stable, happy, loving relationship again. And, you know, that in itself hasn't come without some judgment, shall we say? But, you know, that's another story.
But do you know what? I've got two words for that, and that's and the first one is fuck, and the second one is them, because you have been to hell and back. You have been to hell and back. You have supported somebody through one of the most challenging things you can ever support anybody through, and it ultimately ended in his death. And you found out in a shocking way, and you were left reeling. And quite frankly, if you found some comfort and happiness, as long as it wasn't in heroin, I would definitely wish you every happiness that possibly comes to you. I really, really do. And the idea that you say that, you know, this showing the children that utterly awful things happen, but it doesn't have to define how you live the rest of your life. And this is a message that I repeatedly try and instill into my children, because I don't want them to be defined by this. Yes, it is a terrible thing that happened, and it will taint the rest of their lives to an extent. But they're allowed to go out into the big world and be happy and to laugh. And I said to a friend recently, actually, I said, you know, we talk about children being like psychopaths. You know, you tell them this earth-shattering news, and they're asking for their iPad 5 minutes later. But again, it's talking about the kind of weird aspects of widowhood and grief, and in your case, talking about addiction and the trauma that it leaves and how far it spreads in the society around you. And I just think, again, talking about this, speaking the truths that have been hidden, we are putting something back into the world. And Sarah, I met you for the first time today, and I am incredibly proud of you. I want to reach through this screen and give you a hug, because what you have just done is monumentally brave. And I hope that you have got a nice, calm afternoon where you can have a cup of tea and put your feet up, because please be as proud of yourself as I am right now. You did an amazing thing just now, and it was an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And you will just make it in time for the WAF party this summer. So I'm going to text you an invite so you've got it. But I do hope that this isn't the last time I speak to you, Sarah, because I've really enjoyed, if enjoyed is the right word, talking to you.
Thanks, Rosie. It's been a real privilege. I'm really very grateful.
It's been lovely, hasn't it? I don't understand how these conversations can be lovely. I think there is a power in speaking to other people who have walked through hell and come out the other side. And you referred to it as work. You've done the work. It is work. It's not easy. Nobody's doing it for you. And the people that I get to sit across from via a screen and hear their stories, I am inspired by every single one of you. So thank you. And to our listeners, thank you for continuing to support what we do and listening to these brave and wonderful people tell their stories. I hope that everybody's okay after this one. I will put a trigger warning on it, and do take care of yourselves. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.